for the fifth and final. Welcome to the fifth and final session of the Hope Consortium 2021 webinar series. My name is Wayne Sorensen, and I'm a project manager with the Family Health Center Incorporated of Marshfield. We're really pleased that you're able to join us today for Safe and Sober Housing, what recovery allies need to know. Before we introduce our speakers, I want to take care of a couple of housekeeping announcements. As a reminder, we are recording this session, and by participating, you consent to be recorded. So feel free to turn either off your video or change your name if that's a concern. The recording of this session, as with the other sessions in the series this year, will be housed on the Hope Consortium website. We typically have those recordings posted about a week after, and towards the end of the webinar, we'll put this webinar will put the address in the chat for you. Please consider muting during the presentation to limit background noise. We want this to be as an interactive and engaging experience, so please jump in with questions or put them in the chat during the presentation. We'll monitor and bring those questions up during the conversation. Shortly after the webinar ends this morning, you'll receive a short survey via email, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. As a first-time run, we're really interested in getting participant reaction as we continue to improve. Want to thank the Hope Training Committee for their feedback on the series topics. This one was one of the topics that was of interest to a lot of folks, so we're very thankful to be able to provide it for you today. Also want to acknowledge the work that Mel Kretschmer does from Family Health Center. She's kind of our wizard behind the curtain and is actually sitting in an undisclosed location with a cool background hiding where she's actually sitting right now. So we want to thank Mel for all the work that she does. One last thing as a wrap up, this is our first series that we've offered as part of the Hope Consortium. We want to thank you all for participating. We've been pleased with the overall response, and we got about 80 total registrations over the course of the spring. The session feedback will help us in terms of understanding the topics and what people learn, but all participants probably in about a week, so sometime next week, will receive an overall evaluation. Since this is a new initiative for the Hope Consortium, we'd like to get as much feedback we can about how we can offer this again in a way that is valuable to the participants. So look for that as well. Enough of me talking. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our co-presenters today. Ginger Morgan is the Director of Candidate and Community Initiatives at Press House Apartments, and she's also the Treasurer of Wisconsin Association of Sober Housing, or WASH. Ginger supports young adults to develop the connections and habits that support their health and allow them to thrive. She is employed by Press House, a nonprofit faith-based organization serving UW-Madison students and Madison area young adults. In 2014, Ginger launched a sober housing program at Press House Apartments called Next Step, serving young adults in recovery. 2017-2018, Ginger worked with recovery community organization leaders and community stakeholders to establish the Wisconsin Association of Sober Housing. The National Alliance of Recovery Residents recognized WASH in 2018 as their official state affiliate. WASH exists to assist sober housing operators succeed in delivering high-quality, ethical recovery residence programs. In January of 2020, WASH hosted their first Sober Housing Huddle Up for the state to provide education, networking, and resources to providers across the state. WASH is currently working to provide education about operational and program standards in order to encourage certification of sober housing operations across the state. Michelle Devine-Giese is currently the CEO of Apricity, which includes residential treatment, contract packaging, sober living, and recovery support services for the recovery community. She also currently serves as the Vice President of WASH. Michelle is a 1993 graduate of UW-Stout with a BS in Business Administration. She holds an AODA certificate from UW-Madison and Fox Valley Technical College and is a licensed substance abuse counselor. Michelle was one of the authors of the Substance Abuse and the Wisconsin Workforce Report, as well as currently sitting on the Planning and Funding Committee of the State Council of Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse, or SCAOTA. And it would, as a personal note, if you have not yet read the Workforce Report, it is well worth taking a look at. It was well done. She has been on her recovery journey since 1995, joining the STEP Industries in 1996. She held many positions with the company, and while president, she opened 3 recovery residences in Neenah. January 1st, 2018, STEP Industries, Employment for Those in Recovery and Sober Living, and Mooring Programs, which provides residential treatment to men and women, merged to form Apricity. And Apricity means the warmth of the sun in the winter. And it is my pleasure to turn it over to Ginger and Michelle.
Thank you, Wayne. We appreciate the invitation and appreciate everyone showing up. What a great crowd, and to have this opportunity to talk with some Northwoods folks about your interest in recovery housing and how we can support people in long-term recovery to move toward long-term recovery. So I am curious if you have access to your keyboard. Some of you may be on phones and it may be more difficult. Just drop in the chat, why is this topic of interest to you? Is there a burning question? Is it just, a general curiosity in terms of what's recovery housing and how does it differ from treatment or inpatient treatment? If you have concerns about recovery housing, we'll capture the chat in addition to the recording, and that'll be really useful information for us down the road. And then it'll also get us started with kind of what questions are you carrying with you today. So I want to go back a little bit to the introduction that Wayne read very kindly about Michelle and I, and talk about how WASH got started and what WASH is, just so that we're on sort of we have an understanding. WASH, the Wisconsin Association of Sober Housing, is a volunteer-based organization. We don't have any paid staff yet. We hope to hire a program coordinator, but it's a professional association and primarily for recovery residence operators and sober housing operators. So our service will be to support recovery housing in the state. All the people on the board right now operate sober housing. So in our other sort of paid work, we do some level of sober housing operations. Okay, so that's just to understand that there's a professional association that we're representing today. And in addition to that, we do some paid work with recovery residences ourselves. We try and collaborate with mental health providers, treatment providers, county health across the state, because we know county health departments are a linchpin for connecting services for people, and it can be a combination of Medicaid and housing and workforce development, all kinds of things, those wraparound services that help people sustain recovery. So that's the sort of understanding of who is WASH. We're really, we hope over the next several years to begin certifying recovery residences based on a set of quality standards. So that's part of why we're here today, to talk about what is the state of recovery residences in Wisconsin? Why is certification important? What is the role of DHS and what is the role of WASH? Many of you may have heard of the very recently launched Recovery Residence Registry that is hosted by the Department of Health Services, and we've been in contact with them about that. That comes out of the legislation that was passed by the Wisconsin legislature that governs recovery services. And one of the things that they said they wanted to do is have a minimum set of standards. And I use the term minimum because there are literally maybe 5 to 8 things that they ask recovery residence operators to self-certify that they do those things. So in my role running Next Step in Madison, I went on the DHS website, I checked through the list, and I registered my house, my program. Now, there is no external verification of that. So you should be really clear when you look at the Recovery Residence Registry that you are going on the good faith effort of the people who sign up for the registry, that they're going to do what they say they're doing. And that in some ways is always the case, unless we get information to the contrary. DHS will investigate if people report to them that people on the registry are not doing what they said they would do, but only in the case where there's a complaint. They're not going to proactively screen those recovery residences. They're just going to try and collect a list of people who say they do these 7 or 8 things and make that available to people in the state. Now, in contrast, as the state affiliate for the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, NAR, and you should have all had access to some information from NAR, they have authored a set of operational standards and ethical standards that they believe correlate with the best outcomes for people in recovery. So the standards then are adopted by the state affiliates, which in this case is WASH, and then we certify recovery residences in our state as following those, meeting those standards. So any certification that is going to happen at this point in the evolution of recovery residences is going to happen through WASH. There is no formal state regulation of recovery residences. There is state regulation of licensed, like CBRF facilities and licensed clinical services, but recovery residences by and large can float under the state licensing and regulation radar. So for that reason, these quality standards, people have to opt in, voluntarily opt in. And we hope over time to build a website with information on who's certified so that consumers and peers can begin to differentiate what's the quality of the place, what standards do they use, what model do they use, and is there anybody who's verifying that they do what they say they're going to do. So that's one bucket of questions. The other really huge bucket of questions, which I think many of the chat that I've seen come in is really around the scarcity of options for people, that there is a lack, there's not enough beds, there isn't enough recovery residence beds. And the other problem is, I mean, there are 2 problems really. One, people have to go out of their region, especially in rural areas of Wisconsin and further north. There are some counties that don't have any recovery residents operating in their county or their region. And so it may be a matter of being out of region and having to travel. The other problem is it's hard to know who does have beds. There's no central, you have to just pick up a phone or email several places and say, do you have a bed available? There isn't any real-time availability of who's got spots available for referrals and matching and placing. So we are aware of those things, and we hope at both as legislation and funding begin to come through that some of those gaps may be addressed and begin to improve. I want to pause before we move to our next section. We're going to talk about some specific things about ethics and standards. I want to see if Michelle wanted to add anything and if there are any questions we want to take at this point.
I think you're covering a lot, Ginger. I think that's a great overview. Yeah.
It's sort of mock speed. Sorry about that. Yeah. If people have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Otherwise, we'll kind of move into the ethics and standards part of our conversation.
Ginger, I guess there are a couple folks at some point that have indicated they actually do have recovery residents in their communities. So I want to throw that out there in the event that we want to at some point during the part of the presentation engage them and get their experience. So I don't know that it needs to be now, but it would be a great opportunity for folks to share their experience at some point.
Right, and I always assume that there is wisdom and experience and knowledge in the room, and you know, Michelle and I are by no means the only people who have a corner on this market or information to share. So I really do hope those of you with experience with recovery residences will speak up and chime in. Please know that I will not be offended. if I get interrupted or if you have something to say, I will value you sharing what you know, and both with questions and your experiences. So just know that there's an open invitation to that.
Great. Thank you.
And we will make sure at a couple points here that we will get you the information if you want to participate in the advisory calls that we do on a monthly basis. That can be a great forum for questions and brainstorming. And also we get the topics that you are interested in, and then we try and address those on a monthly call. For instance, we're going to be starting a series on funding and fundraising and grants. And I see that a lot of you have put comments in there about paying and funding. And so that might be something you would be interested in. So we'll make sure you guys get that information.
We have a hand up, Eugene Olson. Do you want to unmute yourself and let us know what you want to share?
Yes. So thank you both for doing this. Very much appreciate it. Like I put in the comments, it is a great need and barrier to our Wisconsin DCC clients. I work as a program and policy analyst for the Department of Corrections, Division of Community Corrections. So part of my duties is overseeing contract administration. And I do work with several of the service providers that are here on the call today. My question was, you touched a little bit about legislation. I'm on the HOPE Consortium, and I think, like you said, I've spoke with a couple of legislators here locally about the housing need and crisis that we're in. And I'm just curious to what the two of you might know or have done as far as touching base with the legislative folks as well too, to see or to make them aware that there is a need. And I want to say we do have some funding, DOC does, to be able to help with it. But like you said also, Ginger, there's just not a lot of recovery sober living houses up in Northwest Wisconsin. So I'm hoping in the future that we can have more as we go forward. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing some of your experience and also your interest in legislation. I can say that the president of the Wisconsin Association for Sober Housing, Peter Brunzell, he is also the director of WisHope in Waukesha. He worked very closely with legislators in some of the recent updates to the HOPE legislation in Wisconsin. And the Sober Housing Registry came about because of that legislation. And I will also say that there were parts of the legislation struck from what was drafted and proposed, which went further in terms of funding certified residences through state funds and through using SAMHSA funds more directly to residences. So we continue in those conversations. I will say there's also some federal legislation that I may, since I'm on legislation, I'll go ahead and see if I can pull up. I don't know if I have it. We may have to send that on a follow-up email. There's some legislation that was proposed at the end of 2020 in the House of Representatives. So it would be a great thing, for example, for people all over the state of Wisconsin to write to their House representatives in particular in support of that legislation. And if I can find it in the course of our conversation, I'll drop it in the chat. We also have some advocacy template letters that we can send out that you can adapt to your own purposes and your own situation to send to your representative. So yes, both on the state level and the federal level, to try and coordinate appropriate funding and with the understanding that people in recovery, if we can help connect people to employment and stable housing and help sustain long-term recovery, that the costs to the state go down. It costs the state much less to have people employed paying taxes than to be incarcerating them. And, right, folks in the Department of Corrections absolutely know this is true. And in terms of healthcare costs, honestly, we sustain a lot of healthcare costs, and there's a lot of co-occurring physical, medical conditions when people are using alcohol or drugs in ways that are detrimental to their health. So law enforcement costs, Department of Corrections costs, loss in economic contributions, and disruptions to families and communities. So we all know that story. I'm sort of preaching to the choir. I don't need to say that to you, but I do think that that's part of what we have to keep in the back of our mind when we suggest to legislators of any political party, this is actually good economically, it's good for the health of our state and for our communities. And I absolutely hear you that there are places in the state that don't have the concentration of services that really would support your communities. And one of those right now is recovery residences.
Yeah, and I think it's just developing, further developing a strategic plan to kind of hone in on and help them understand exactly what you're talking about. Because I know there's also legislation here in our area in Northwest Wisconsin about mental health beds and adding more mental health beds, which I think is okay. But again, we don't have that step down. We just don't have that next level that once they're released with dealing with a mental health crisis, where do they go? And that's really what is missing. And then the other thing that was helpful, and I'm just sharing because I know we need to move on, is there's a bill, and I don't know off the top, but I know it was proposed by the state representatives to change the law on record expungement. And that is also a barrier. In the past, if you had a criminal record, it couldn't be reviewed after the age of 25. So there's legislation now that is, I think it's making it through the steps, and it might have even gotten signed. I don't know for sure, so don't quote me on that, but that would be helpful too, because again, those step downs, even coming from a recovery home to leaving a recovery home, that's a barrier there as well too, when you have that criminal history with finding your next landlord to rent to you. So
right,
so
both in housing and in employment, those
Yes.
records can really create barriers. Well, that's a great segue into the next thing that I want to discuss. I sent out a chart of levels, but there's another chart. I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about what Eugene was just alluding to, which is the transition from more intensive treatment into long-term recovery. And this chart is one on the National Alliance for Recovery Residents website. It's in a white paper that they have buried on page 16. But what I wanted to just give you a visual representation and then talk a little bit about the recovery levels and how this corresponds. So the first thing you should know is not everybody comes to a recovery residence having been or accessed inpatient treatment. Not everyone gets the stabilization, the high acute care inpatient medical and psychiatric treatment. Some people go from county detox. Some people go from their home and from AA meetings or NA meetings and start seeking sober housing. So you can enter sober housing from any of these levels. It doesn't have to be sequential, but there is some evidence that getting treatment and going through some of these stabilization phases helps equip people for more successful recovery. Michelle, do you want to
Yeah,
chime in?
I wanted to clarify that each recovery residence has their own set of criteria for who will be accepted. So I just didn't want people to
Mhm.
think
Right.
everybody was accepting people from detox. Some only accept people from a facility or from residential treatment. So everybody's got their own criteria.
Right. And the criteria should, and usually it relates to what level of service can that sober home safely provide. So you don't want to admit someone that's at a higher acuity than what you can manage in your setting. So everyone should set their own sense of what does it take to qualify to be admitted into this, residential setting. So some do require the more intensive stabilization and a referral, and some don't. And that's, one of the reasons why it's helpful to know what are the different levels of recovery residences. And when you're talking with recovery residence operators, or when your clients are talking to them, to ask questions about what kind of staffing they have, what kind of support and structures, how structured a program is it? And by structured, I mean, for the acute care, the service intensity high level 4, they're going to be in programming for part of their day. So for example, in my program, which is a level 2, kind of a 1.5 to level 2 program, it's a very independent program. My expectation is that residents are either employed or they're students or both, and they are maintaining their own recovery through therapy, through peer, community peer support, and they're attending community meetings once a week. But there isn't a daily program that they have to report to in my program. Some programs that are higher level of service, there are going to be daily groups or things that folks have to report to, how often drug screening happens, access to technology, all of those kind of parameters of stabilization and long-term recovery are going to vary based on how independent and how much support there is. So when you get to the level 2 and level 1, you assume people have some experience in recovery. They have some day-to-day functioning toward employment or toward community volunteering, community engagement, or education. And they're moving toward being able to transition to a fully independent life in recovery.
Ginger,
I would say one other thing before I take questions, level 3 and level 4 very often have licensed clinical staff. Either the recovery residence contracts with an outside organization or has staff hired themselves, and they deliver services in a residential setting. So with level 3 and level 4, you're talking about some state licensing, but also clinical licenses of people who may be licensed therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists that may be consulting or available to residents. Was there a question?
Yeah, I just noticed in the chat that Stacy Hildy asked a question, if there are some sort of outline guidelines of questions that providers should ask to determine which level one of their clients would be most appropriate for. And then she followed up, they get probation agents and social workers trying to place people who just use within days and have never had a period of recovery more than a month. So does NAR have those, any sort of standards or guidelines that providers can use as they try to place people?
Do you have thoughts about that, Michelle? You take people higher up on the acuity level.
Yeah. So the quick answer is no. There are not set guidelines. Each program really needs to address what their ability is. So just as an example, our program, we have residential treatment, inpatient, that 28, 30 days of regimented treatment. Then we have transitional residential where there's that more freedom. Then we have sober living, and we have 2 levels of sober living. So we don't accept anybody into our sober living programs with less than 30 days and generally have to be coming from some sort of treatment, formal treatment. But like Ginger said, there are programs that will let people come in straight from detox. And I think it all depends on what your capacity is. Do you have live-in experienced, qualified people that can handle everything that goes along with somebody just coming from detox? And what level of do you want to be on the scale? You know, do you want to be we're a 2.5 and a 1.5, and you don't have to fit exactly into a category. That's not, it's just kind of a guideline. But I don't think we can just tell you who you should accept and who you shouldn't. It's really your experience and who you're going to have in the homes and who's going to be running it.
Are there other questions about I sent a chart, I think Wayne or Melanie sent the chart of the different services, who the clients of the 4 levels of service, and I just showed you the kind of curve. Are there questions about the 4 levels before we move on to some ethical and standard guidelines? You can unmute yourself if I don't see you, because I can't see all of you at once. All right. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and we're going to talk a little bit about the ethics that developed by NAR for recovery residences. And part of what you should understand in the backdrop of this conversation is that NAR came about in part because of some operators that were doing exploitative and illegal things. So it primarily insurance fraud, billing insurances for unnecessary drug tests, some kickback schemes from treatment centers to residential, and then other settings where in fact people would come and then there's a sort of underground drug trade going. So it keeps people stuck in a situation. And NAR came about to try and establish what are the standards that actually recovery residences should meet, and that we can then evaluate and certify people based on. So I'm just gonna share this code of ethics, and you all can read for yourself. We don't have to run through it, but just to understand that there are these, looks like 20 different things. Each member of the Wisconsin Association for Sober Housing, as a part of their certification, have to have this code of ethics signed and on the file that they agree to comply. And I am gonna, let's talk real quick. So it's a residents' strengths and needs, determine the appropriate level of support. So you see right off the bat, it is in part the residents' responsibility to say, I can serve this resident or I can't, and that we have the appropriate level of support or we don't. And if we don't, to try and refer to other organizations that we're aware of that may have the right level of support. Value diversity and non-discrimination, provide a safe home-like environment. Now, some of the facilities that are level 4 may have a more institutional feeling, but the overall value is to be a home, to be not just a rented room where people come and go, but to provide a home, and in that home to have a social model of recovery, peer-to-peer support, peer-to-peer sharing, in some cases staff and clinical support around that as well. Maintain an alcohol and illicit drug-free environment, honor individuals' rights to choose their recovery path. So there's not a one size fits all for WASH and for NAR, though each organization gets to define what recovery path it can support. So there are tensions within recovery residence operations about the purity of, for example, 12-step models, and whether or not there's been a lot of back and forth around medication-assisted treatment. It is the standard for DHS and it is the standard for NAR and WASH that we support residences providing medication-assisted treatment appropriate to their level of service. So for example, as a level 2, 1.5 level 2, I can't keep or monitor people's medication-assisted treatment. So if they can go to a facility and receive it where it's being monitored, if they have to have blood drawn and that kind of thing, we don't have the services available. I can't guarantee. They have to be able to lock their medications in a safe lockbox in their own room and get to and from their own treatment and get the right medical monitoring. If they can do it at that level, I don't exclude anyone who's receiving medication assisted treatment. However, if they need me to administer it, I can't do it. So that would be one of those places where I would then refer to another provider for that kind of thing. There are some places that I guess I will call them old school. That may not be a fair thing, but there are some places who are like, no substances, nothing, you're off things or you're on them. And they don't even like mental health medications. And by and large, that's not the standard that WASH goes by. Prescribed medications, all of those should be allowed if they're taken as prescribed, and medication-assisted treatment is a valid pathway to recovery.
I wanted to just chime in because Ginger's mentioned it a couple times about making referrals, and some of you had made comments in the chat about it. That one of the goals of WASH is to have a place where people who are running the residences can put their information, like about their level and who they accept, into one spot. And then as they have availability, that would be updated real time as well, so that when Ginger has this situation and needs to find a referral spot, they would have real access to that. That's our goal.
Mm-hmm. It is not in place yet, but it is what we are working toward.
So I noticed a question, Ginger and Michelle, that is kind of related to one of the first ethical standard in terms of a facility accepting people that they can reasonably support and care for. Stacy Hildy asked a question with level 3 and level 4, do they need to have a state license to be able to provide those kind of services, or does the number one ethics expectation kind of not eliminate the need, but does buffer the need to be a licensed CBRF?
At this time, you would not need to be a CBRF to operate 3 or 4, but you'll need to look at what the criteria is for those levels. It's pretty high with what the needs are as far as licensed staff. I don't personally know of any level 4s that are operating as recovery residences in the state.
Right, level 4s really are treatment providers, and they're not operating really as a recovery residence. They're operating as a treatment provider that then refers into sober housing as the next phase, with either like an IOP model or a recovery residence model. All right. I'm going to stop the share. You get the idea. These are, we can make this available. If you did not receive I think you may have received the code of ethics. If not, it's on the NAR website and we can make that available to you. The last thing I wanted to share are just an overview of the standards that we use to certify, that we use to certify recovery residences. I'm going to stop my share again. Sorry. You've got to love Zoom. You'd think that we all, after this point, have figured all of these things out, but we're still bumbling along on occasion. All right, so here is the last. So there are basically 4 domains of standards. Yeah, so there are specific criteria under each of these domains, but when we certify recovery residents, we're going to look at each of the domains and each of the principles in the domains and the particular standards. So you see under domain 1, principle A, operate with integrity, there are 4 standards associated with that. Uphold residents' rights. There are 2 standards associated with that. So we will look for a policy on residents' rights. We will look for basically operating with integrity. Do you do what you say? And do you make what you do plainly available to people? Create a culture of empowerment where residents engage in governance and leadership. And obviously, depending on the level of structure, this will change over time. So my residents get quite a lot of say, for example, on who comes into the program and who doesn't, who they think is ready for the program. They can help shift our practices around how often we're drug testing and that sort of thing. And they pretty much are self-governed in terms of living together. So what happens in the kitchen and how they're doing chores and all of that. So as you go into the lower levels from 4 to 1, residents take more and more responsibility for taking leadership and governance as their recovery allows them to step into leadership. Develop staff abilities to apply the social model. The social model is the social model of recovery, which basically says people in recovery need to be around other people in recovery. And having social support, it is not a purely medical model. It doesn't mean that the medical support and clinical support isn't important, but this is the complementary piece. This is the piece that comes alongside treatment and medication to help learn habits, to help be in relationship, connect to personal goals, develop life skills that will allow recovery to go forward in time. Then we have physical environment standards around whether it's a home-like environment, whether it's a safe and healthy environment. You know, how many bathrooms are there? Are there exits? Is there, what's the fire safety? Things like that. Recovery support, facilitate active recovery and recovery community engagement, promote and model pro-social behaviors and relationship enhancement skills. I think we all, for only being 1 standard, we all spend a lot of time on that particular principle because there's so much interpersonal work that has to be done in living environments. And then cultivate the residents' sense of belonging and responsibility, and finally being a good neighbor. And I will say that the being a good neighbor standard has to do with being in communication with neighbors, being respectful, and it tries to move against some of the not in my backyard impulse that people may have when they hear that there are people who are in recovery from substance use disorders in their neighborhood or moving into their neighborhood. And Michelle has some great stories about, managing some of those reactions, but it's the expectation that our residents and our operators are proactive in building neighbor relations and community relations. And it's part of what the key to success is going to be, is building relationships, letting people get to know you and letting people get to know the residents so that we can disarm some of the fear and anxiety around being neighbors with people in recovery. Are there questions about the standards or about certification that we should go over? Or do we want to sort of jump to some of the situation that you all are in? We're right down to about 15 minutes left. It's a good time to take general questions and for you all to share your information.
This is Stacy Hildy. With that recovery residence registry that DHS has, there's a note about like a grievance procedure. So it's difficult to write one because we don't know what happens after the grievance is filed. Can you speak to that?
The grievance, we had a meeting with DHS to ask them this question. And as I recall, they forward the grievance for an investigation. And they have a mechanism in DHS, people who are used to doing investigations who do them. I don't know what, like if the people who file the grievance, I don't know, for example, if they get feedback about the outcome of the investigation or the outcome of the grievance. It isn't clear to us how DHS is going to manage that. In all fairness, we're not managing it for DHS, they're having to manage it. And I think their primary determination is whether or not they will keep a recovery residence on their list, not to resolve the grievance between two parties, but whether or not they should keep that recovery residence on their list based on their investigation. We have a grievance process as well. The difficulty is if a recovery residence has not affiliated with WASH, most places don't feel any need to respond. If we say, hey, we've had a grievance, they're like, and? So what? Who are you? And so what we try and do when we get a grievance about a recovery residence not yet affiliated with us is to come alongside and say, look, our goal is to have recovery residences succeed. That is the base of our goal. And if we can help you clarify where this concern came from and improve your operations in some way, we are interested in doing that. So we try really hard not to start from a finger pointing place. And we always assume there are two sides to every story, and there always are, at least two, sometimes more, sometimes 3 or 4 sides to any given story. And so what we try and do is identify for the people who are making grievances to us about a recovery residence. One of the questions we ask is, what kind of outcome are you looking for? Do you just want someone to follow up and have a conversation with them about this because it bothers you and you don't think it should continue to happen to other people? Are you looking for some kind of corrective action that would make you feel better? What would restore the grievance in a way? We're not always in a position to accomplish those things, but it's always useful to know, what do people think will help them put something to rest? So I can't answer for DHS. I do know they have somebody designated to do their investigations, and primarily what that means is the residence is either going to be on their registry or not, based on the outcome of their investigation.
Okay, one thing I did see when I was kind of going through the process, well, if I was going to file a grievance, what happens? I don't know who we can speak to at DHS. Maybe you do know this. It does not really give you an option to file a grievance against a recovery residence because it doesn't fit into the categories that they offer you. So do you know who we would speak to about that to improve that process?
I can find out.
Thank you so much.
I would think it's Paul Krupski.
It's not Paul, though.
Oh, it's to
I don't.
update?
It's the other woman we spoke to that Paul put us in touch with. Let me look. I can find her name. Hang on.
Okay. And I'll just say that one of the reasons we wanted to speak with them was this kind of specific reason. Like, are you going to be going to the facilities? Are you going to be doing any sort of inspection with places, because we think people will assume because they're on a list for DHS that they've been vetted. And we were concerned that some of the places may not be as ethical as they could be.
I have just dropped into the chat, Kimberly Adams is the person I believe is responsible for the Recovery Residence Registry, Sober Housing Registry. And she was the person that we talked to about this. So I would start with her, and you can also come to the WASH website and file a grievance. And as I said, there are parameters around what we may be able to do, but we're happy to be in conversation, try and be in conversation with the recovery residents, whether or not they're affiliated with us.
Ginger, there was Tammy Erickson put a question in there in terms of templates, guides, steps, training for communities and individuals to take open sober living housing. How can providers and communities promote others to open up facilities? Can you talk about, is that something that WASH does as an advocacy for local communities, or is there a place where someone like Tammy can go to get some of those resources?
We don't yet. I think part of our goal as we do more statewide conferences, part of what we'll probably develop is a pre-conference workshop on starting a sober housing operation. We are also hoping to put together policy guides and templates, though there is not a one size fits all. So it's a very difficult, I mean, I'm reluctant to say, WASH will, provide a package. I do know, for example, like Michelle's organization serves as a consultant to organizations wanting to start sober housing. So she could probably talk in terms of a private consultant, what's available. We don't yet have the capacity in WASH to do it, but that's what we're building towards. So we may have a series of videos, for example, and policies that are available, and our current members are sharing templates and policies with each other. So being on the once a month call can be a really, if you want to be added to the WASH list, the advisory list, then we have a once a month call and we talk, about operating sober housing, and other members have been very helpful to one another, sharing policies that they use. So.
And Ginger, getting added to that WASH list, can individuals go to the website and request to be added to?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can also email me directly.
So I'm curious, we've had a couple of folks who talked about specific populations. Sarah Saluski mentioned jail population, Gene Olson with corrections, so folks coming out of the criminal justice system. And looking at standards, are there any do the standards fit for anybody interested in developing a facility regardless of audience, or are there some things that folks might want to consider, whether it's a jail population or corrections population, gender, orientation, things like that? Are there nuggets of wisdom that we need to consider if folks are trying to set up something specifically for a specific population?
Yes, I would say the standards are general for recovery housing, and each organization has to leverage and equip itself for special populations. So if people have an interest in serving LGBTQ folks, then I think it's incumbent upon them to try and develop the kinds of competencies to serve that population if you're interested in. And some houses will bridge, like I've had trans identified folks in my program, and partly it's a small, pretty intimate program, and with the consent of everybody involved. So policies around gender are going to vary from recovery residents to recovery residents. Most of them right now are very gendered in a very traditionally binary way. And when people who are trans identified come into that, it can be really awkward. And so trying to get recovery residences to state whether or not they serve trans-identified women or trans-identified men in a traditionally male or female setting is a really important thing. And that's part of what WASH will try and do in terms of cultural competencies, understanding gender and sexuality, understanding special needs for folks who have legal and criminal justice involvement and those kinds of things.
Great.
I think something that also you need to keep in mind is the neighborhood where you're going to be having specific populations. Like we've run into, women are easier to open up a sober living house than men, for instance. The neighbors, because ours are very residential, there seems to be an additional barrier with men.
And a lot of recovery residence operators would tell you that men's houses are easier to fill and women's houses are harder to fill. Women, for whatever reason, there are barriers, whether it's children, whether it's relationships. I get a lot more applications. I have my programs open for men or women. I've always had twice as many men applying as women.
We experience the exact same. We have 2 houses for men, 1 for women.
Just looking, there's a couple of additional comments. Sarah Saluski indicated, recommended a screen to see if they're on probation, parole, and have a plan in place. And Stacy Hildy talked about the need for WRRN is addressing the need for a recovery residence registry. I think that has come up. Sarah also responded to some of the struggles that she has for folks that are required to register as sex offenders. And again, we talked some about some of those considerations. Michelle, you had mentioned neighborhood is, so I think those are considerations. We've got about a minute. Are there other questions that folks have that they want to get out in front of our 2 distinguished guests today?
Well, I see the comment about what level of detail they're asking for, like costs and gender and all of that. And again, that is our goal, is to have that on the WASH website. And as far as we know, we would be the only ones having that level of detail, but Peter does try and keep up with just locations of other facilities. But again, those are not vetted or screened. It's just information.
And when Michelle says Peter, she means the WisHope.
Oh.
The WisHope website has a listing of recovery residences around the state, and it's sort of a voluntary opt-in. They try and find out if there are places, and you can put yourself on WisHope's map, basically. Eugene had raised his hand.
Yep. Just a quick, I guess, comment is I'm just wondering, a lot of this is workload issue. How you guys reach out to the local universities for interns to try to help some, put together templates and website information and stuff like that. So just a comment, I guess, because a lot of this is just the time it takes to put a lot of this information together.
Right. I will say, we have been provisionally approved for a grant that will help. We hope to be hiring a staff member who can then also supervise interns, because interns require supervision and direction. And so I appreciate the suggestion, and hopefully some of this will be accelerating in coming months based on some new resources we will be able to announce publicly, hopefully in the next few weeks.
Well, as always happens with these webinars, we are at our alleged end time, but I guess we want to thank both Michelle and Ginger for joining us today. Melanie, closing reminders for the folks that are still on?
I'll just be getting out the survey for feedback to all the attendees, and then I'll populate those results and get them over to Ginger and Michelle.
Great. And for those that are still on, Mel did pop in the training website, so expect to see this recording in about a week. I have no doubts that we will be talking with both of you in a future webinar. So I want to thank Ginger and Michelle for sharing their expertise with us. Thank you all for playing along with us for the last several months, for those of you that have attended multiples, and wish everybody a good summer. We look for the evaluation on the overall program, and we have every intention of running this again at some point, fall or spring of next year. So enjoy the rest of your summer, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.